So glad to see you here. Okay. Raise your hand if you're not here. There we go. Let me check on something. I'll be back. Okay. Here we go. She should say, I've been thrown out of better churches than this one. Listen, we're going to have some fun together here, and I'm thankful that you guys are all here. We're going to begin to talk a little bit about the techniques of a leader. What do leaders do? What are some of their techniques that change the game, that really make them more effective in what they're doing? So here we go. We're going to just start right off in the ninth concept here. If you're going to lead well, you're going to need to learn how to play to your strengths, okay? And this is an important concept that a lot of us live lives and never really learn. Here's what I believe. I think that people need to stop playing to their passions, because that is a formula for failure. Now listen carefully about what I'm saying, to what I'm about to say here, because what I'm about to say here completely goes against the grain of our culture. How many of you in here have heard people over and over again tell you to play to your passions? What is your passion, they'll say. What do you want to do for your life? What is your passion? Anybody ever heard something like that? I mean, it's over and over and over again. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with passion. But what we have to understand is that we have got to stop playing to our passions, because it's a formula for failure. Question. You have a teenage daughter. She's 16. She's going out on her first date. How many of you parents in here would ever send her out with this advice? Sweetie, you two just go out tonight and play to your passions. Really? No. Playing to our passions is a formula for failure. Instead, what we need to learn to do is play to our strengths, and then make our strengths our passions. In other words, Steve, maybe I want to be the leadoff quarterback this year for the Steelers, okay? I want to play first string quarterback for the Steelers this year. That might be my passion, but how many of you in here think there's a shot at that happening? But if I put all my energies, all my efforts into trying to make that happen, what am I going to be? Defeated, frustrated, angry, cynical, apathetic. It doesn't work out. So the best advice for any leader to understand is that we're not about playing to our passions. We're about playing to our strengths. That's very important to understand. One of the companies that's done a great job at this is Walmart. You know, you've probably never seen Walmart come on television and say, hey, we're selling America's finest quality jewelry. Come on down here and look at some of our watches. Why? Because they don't sell fine quality jewelry. They sell okay jewelry at a great, great price. Okay? That's their story. On the other hand, have any of you in here ever heard Saks Fifth Avenue run an ad, or seen one of their magazine ads where they say, you know, we're selling America's cheapest wristwatches. Come on down here and get 12 for each arm. I mean, really? No. They sell very high-end, high-quality merchandise at commensurate prices. This is what they do. And the reason that both these companies have succeeded is that they've stayed in their lanes. Walmart does its thing, totally good, totally legitimate. Saks does its thing, totally good, totally legitimate. And this is key to everything. We need to know what our strengths are. We need to play to our strengths. One of the greatest examples of this goes back to the 1950s. Probably most of you aren't old enough to remember this. I can barely remember a little bit of it myself. But back in the 1950s, there was effectively really only one car rental company in America that amounted to more than a hill of beans. And that company was Hertz. And everywhere you turn back in the 50s and into the 60s, Hertz was everywhere. I mean, they were on television with their jingle singing, "Let Hertz put you in the driver's seat," and they were using the big stars of the day in their full-color magazine ads. But technically, there was a number 2 rental car company out there. Most people had never even heard of Avis. Why? Because Avis was so far back in the pack, they just didn't hardly exist. Avis was about to go bankrupt. They had the dubious distinction of having lost money for the previous 5 years. But they but they pulled together about $1 million, and they began approaching ad agencies in New York City one by one, asking them for this. They were saying, "Will you give me a $2 million ad campaign for our $1 million?" And one by one, those ad agencies were saying, "No, we can't do that." But one day, they hit the door of a young agency that has since become one of the biggest in the world, Doyle, Dane, and Bernbach. Doyle, Dane, and Bernbach sat down with Avis. They listened to their story, and they said, "Yes, we'll take your challenge, provided one thing, provided you let us do this our way." Well, Avis didn't have much to lose, so they said, "Okay, you do it your way." And with that was born the most unique advertising campaign up to that point that had ever come along. Because up until that point, almost all advertising claimed that its product was the biggest, the best, the most bombastic one out there. They were the very best. But for the first time ever, an advertiser came along and admitted up front, "We're number 2. But they followed that with a promise by saying, "But we'll try harder." And they actually did. They made sure that their cars were cleaner. They made sure that their counter help was the very best anywhere. And you know what happened? America's love for the underdog kicked in. And people at the airports began to step out of the Hertz line into the Avis line. And for about a 40-year run there, Avis was the fastest growing car rental company on the planet. Now, they've really meandered a whole way off that path since. But it worked because they didn't claim to be something they weren't. They admitted the truth. They played to their strengths. They said, "Hey, we're number 2, but here's our strength. We will try harder." And they kept that promise, and it really worked. What are the results? Avis has had, like I said, they had at that point about a 40-year run of success like no corporation in that industry had ever had before. We can do things when we understand that we need to play to our strengths and do things differently. And even before I go to this next one here, I just need to urge you to understand this concept. Don't try to be something you're not. God gave you individual talents. Young man, the Bible says that your parents, if they'll raise you the way that they should, when you're old, you won't depart from that. Okay, now that is not a promise. Parents, there are some great parents out there who've raised some pretty rowdy kids. We know that. That is a principle. And Proverbs needs to be understood that way. If you don't, you think, well, the Bible doesn't make sense. But it does. But here's the deal. Here's the deal. If you read that passage real carefully, really what the writer is saying, raise up a child in the way that he should go. That means, it comes from the Aramaic and from the Hebrew, it means in the bent that he should go. Every young person, there's a kiddo over there, we got you. All 3 of you guys have bents. And for that matter, all of us adults in here, we have bents. Certain things that we tend to do, certain things that we have strengths in. We've got to identify those, and we've got to play to those. Those are God-given strengths that you can develop and use in beautiful, beautiful ways going forward. Here's the 10th concept. We see people all the time saying, "Get in touch." Listen to me carefully. If you want to be a leader, the challenge is not to get in touch. Okay? That's not it at all. The challenge is to stay in touch. You've got to have presence. You've got to be there. I can still remember Shirley Boone telling me a story. Y'all remember Pat and Shirley Boone? Pat Boone? Shirley died, as many of you probably know, about 3 years ago. But Pat's been a close friend for decades. And I remember I was at their home one day. Actually, I was working on a book with them. It's this book right here. And we've got a few books back there. I'll tell you about these later. But anyways, we were working on this book together. And Shirley and Pat and I were talking about mentoring. And Shirley told me something. She said, "Steve, one of the things that I always tried to do was to keep Pat high in the girls' eyes." They had 4 daughters. And she said, "I realized that he was gone so much of the time that I was kind of taking over the running of the whole show here. And she said, I wanted the girls to understand that Pat was present. And she said, I remember one time he was on a 7-week tour of Japan and parts of Asia. And she said, I made up my mind that any big decision that came along, we were going to ask Dad to help us make that decision. And she said, there may have been a 12-hour time difference. But I was on the phone with the girls, calling Pat, saying, what do you think we ought to do about this or about that? Now, that was not the optimal way to do it at all. But that was a smart, smart wife. Shirley was one of the sweetest women that has ever been hatched. She was a good, good lady. And the point is, she made sure that to the best of her power, Pat was present. Pat made his share of mistakes back in those days. And he regrets those now. But the point is, if you're going to lead properly, you've got to be present. You've got to be in people's lives. This is critical. It's very, very important to understand this. Therefore, encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are already doing. A good leader does this. They're present. They're involved. Not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. It's important, Christians, for us to be together. It's important for us to be present with one another if we're going to be the church that God wants us to be. And again, listen carefully to what I'm saying here. I love these online opportunities for people that are at home, that are ill and are infirm. That's perfect. We do this at Antioch too. But Christians, we need to also understand that we don't just sit home and watch church on television forever. We need to be involved. We need to be present. We need to be engaged. That's an important thing to understand, because it's so easy in what's happened in the culture since COVID to kind of disengage. And it's hard to grow. It's hard to be what we want to be for God and involved in other people's lives the way we should be if we're not here on a routine basis. That's important to understand, and we have to do that. We have to reach out before there's an issue with the people that we're attempting to lead. This means, Christians, if there's somebody in your sphere of influence that you have some influence over, make those phone calls. Sometimes you're busy, we don't want to do it. Make your phone calls. Down in the South, we can make calls in the car. I don't know if you guys can do that up here or not. But I mean, when I've got a 20-minute drive, I have plans for calls I'm going to be making on that trip. I use my time as carefully as I know how to. We're going to talk a little bit about time management later in this visit. But at the same point, be in touch with the people that you lead. When you read a great article, maybe it's a book, send it to them. Just send them an email with it on, or bring it to them and hand it to them. That's even the better way to do it. Share things with people that are helping you, these people that you have some influence over. Consider sending them other things as the year passes. If you go on vacations, or even if you don't, if you do something fun, shoot a picture of it and send it to them. Don't just put it on Facebook. Send it directly to them. That tells them that you consider them friends, that you want to be in touch with them. If you've got a great recipe, whatever it is, send it to those people. Stay in touch. Here's what we need to remember. Having a prior relationship helps us assume the best of one another. In leadership, there are always going to be points of conflict or points of difference. It's important that you have money in the bank. That is credibility in the bank. I don't mean literal physical cash, and I'm not talking about a bank downtown. I'm talking about in the bank of a relationship between the two of you, that you have invested in them already enough that if you have to deal in some way that is negative, they understand that you love them to death and that it's not coming out of your ego. It's not something that you're just trying to push on them. Number 12, let me talk to you about how to deliver bad news. That's kind of what I was just now talking about. How do we deliver bad news? Anybody like delivering bad news? Anybody? Shame on you if you do. Nobody should enjoy having to deliver bad news. How many of you in here have had to deliver bad news in the past and you haven't done it because you didn't want them to be mad? Raise your hands. This is one time I'm going to ask for a show of honesty. We got 3, 4 people on, 5, 6, 7, 8. We got a few of you in here that are on. Okay, Al's finally fessed up. Okay, 9 of you. But every one of us have had to deliver bad news in the past. We have. Now, how do we do that? How do we make it as effective and as kind as we possibly can? Let me share 3 facts about this. Number one, sometimes we have to deliver bad news. Number two, we all hate doing this. We're afraid of the outcome. And number three, frequently we do it wrong, making things worse, right? Let me explain to you about how to cut off a dog's tail. And by the way, this is an illustration only. Don't you dare ever hurt a dog. I like dogs, not so much cats, but I love dogs. And I'm not suggesting we do this. But if you want to cut a dog's tail off, there are essentially two ways to do it. Number one, you could just whack that thing off at one moment, and that dog isn't going to be a bit happy, okay? So that's the way you do it. Cut it off one whack at a time, and you have one mad dog, okay? Or you could do it another way. You could cut that dog's tail off 1 inch at a time and have that poor dog screaming over and over and over again. When you have to deliver bad news, get onto it. Deal with it one time, put it behind, and go forward. Don't dribble around, don't nickel and dime, don't be so worried that they're going to get upset that they don't really fully understand what you're trying to communicate. We've got to step into these things if we're going to do things the way God really wants us to do them. Here are my suggestions. Don't pretend that bad news is good news. It's not. You know, be honorable when you're talking to somebody. Be direct and be truthful in what you're saying. Give an explanation, and if need be, apologize. I'm sorry I have to share this with you. I'm sorry I haven't spoken to you sooner about this. Whatever you can say in that vein will help diffuse this a little bit. Understand that other person's frustration. Get in their shoes. Not so much that you kind of fold yourself and you feel so bad about it you don't do it. But get in their shoes. Understand how this may be hurting them. Invite questions. Don't just drop the bad news and walk off, but ask them, do you have some questions, something that you'd like to talk further about here? And you know, one of the things that leaders tend to do, we hate delivering bad news so much that we just do it like a guillotine. We just cut the neck off and then we run. That's the worst way to do it. Share the bad news and then don't chicken out. Don't run away from anything. Sit there and say, listen, I know this isn't what either one of us wanted to be talking about. Do you have some questions, or do you want to share some ideas or your feelings with me? Be that kind of person. And use that word feelings occasionally. You know, I'm not that much into touchy-feely stuff. I think we need to have hard data. But at the same moment, people respond based on their feelings 90% of the time. So don't be shy about asking another person what their feelings are on something. Thank them for the past times that you've enjoyed together. Remember that. And by the way, I see some of you taking notes. Don't be shy if you want to grab your cameras and take pictures up here. Anything I'm sharing today, you're welcome to use with anybody that you can use it with, okay? Here's what we need to remember. We need to remember that when we're sharing bad news, we need to take what I call the roller coaster approach. Back when I was a little guy, I was scared to death of roller coasters. I looked a whole lot like that little girl right there on a roller coaster. I was scared to death of them. Only time I rode a roller coaster was when I was with a bunch of my buddies, and they all wanted to ride one, and I didn't want to admit that I was scared to death. But I was. I was scared to death of those. That little girl right there, I can so identify with her. And look at her mom on the left. You can pretty much identify with her too, right? But here's what I learned. I learned that life is full of roller coasters, both literal and metaphoric. We're always going to have roller coasters. We're going to have those moments of things that we're afraid to do, we don't want to do, like delivering bad news, but we still have to do it. So here's what I learned about roller coasters. I learned that if I was ever going to deal with them, I had to deal with them on their terms. That means that when we go over a hill, I throw my hands in the air and I scream and shout, and I don't white knuckle this thing. I'm into the ride. These days, and by the way, I love roller coasters. These days, I look a whole lot more like those guys. Whoops, get back there. Like those guys right there. I have a hoot on a roller coaster. And I'm telling you, you can learn to have a hoot delivering bad news. I don't mean that you're enjoying hurting the other person, but you understand that you have a skill set now that can bring real blessings to another person. Bad news correctly delivered is a good thing. You need to understand that because if you're going to lead, you're going to have to deliver some of it. So what is our purpose in life as a leader? I would suggest that our purpose is to make sure that we're blessing the other person's day. That's what we're here for. We're here to bring joy and blessings to other people. Joy, by the way, and happiness, by the way, are not the same thing. Do we understand that? Okay? There's a big difference. Happiness is a feeling that comes and goes. Joy is a heart relationship that is there even in the worst of times, okay? So what I want to do is I want to bless other people's days. I want to bring joy into their lives, okay? I don't mind to tell a joke and have everybody happy. That's fine. But what I really want to do, I want today, when I get back on that airplane this evening, I want to be thinking, I hope, pray God that I did this. And I've been praying about this ever since, well, earlier this past week about being here today. I hope that I can bring some joy into your lives, some blessing into your lives today. That is more important to me than I can explain to you. I mean that. I'm a very flawed person. I'm frequently disappointed in my own wife's husband on a lot of stuff. 99.999% of the stuff that's out there I couldn't do on a bet. But there are a few little things that I'm considered a national expert on. So those are my strengths, and that's what I lean into. And I'm really hoping that I can bring benefit to everybody here today. So we're here to bless other people's lives. I'm going to show you a video that you're not going to enjoy watching. It's only about 45 seconds long, but let's watch this. I've got some things I want to say. Notice what he's doing. He's banging on that woman's chair in front of him. She's leaning back, and he's mad. Okay, there he sits banging on her chair. You'll notice that he's on the back row. He's in a chair that does not recline, which he bought at a cheaper price. Okay? Now here's my question. Who's wrong here? Would you say the guy's wrong? Would you say the woman's wrong? Or would you say maybe the airline's trying to cram too many people in too little space? Well, I think the guy's wrong. I actually believe he's wrong. I think probably the woman is wrong, that you need to be leaned back that much. You can argue that maybe. And I think the airline might be wrong, but again, before we get too hard on the airline, remember this. The days when people were willing to pay high dollars for seats are long gone. That stopped in the 80s. So since the 80s, airlines have had to commoditize what they're selling. In other words, they've had to try to get more bodies on an airplane because they're selling the tickets for less money. And that's what they have to do to make the income they have to keep that airline going. And by the way, airline business is a tough one to stay in. So is it the consumer's fault maybe? I mean, maybe it's because we've demanded a seat for a whole lot less money. And they simply cannot give us the kind of seat we used to get for that lower price. So who's at fault? Well, or is there maybe something greater at work here? And I think that might be part of it. Christians these days, and I don't have to tell you this, you all know it, we're living in a time when rage is the rage. Have you noticed that America's mad? And we're mad at each other? And I don't know how this is going to end. Some people predict pretty bad things. I don't know that that'll happen, but it's in a mess right now. Rage is the rage. It seems like kindness is out of fashion. Let me tell you something. A few months ago, 2 or 3 months ago, Bonnie and I started working on a project, and we bought a little piece of land, about 5 acres, outside of Nashville. It's less than an hour out, but the difference out there is radical. I mean, we're out literally in the middle of nowhere, in the country. And in Nashville, traffic is a snarl all the time. People were mad. People were blowing their horns, cutting in, and all this carrying on. Sometimes I find myself getting ticked off in traffic too. I'm not proud of that, but I've committed that sin. But when I go down to Cornersville, Tennessee, population 1,200, when you pass a car, you wave at them. And if there's 2 people at an intersection, they're trying to get the other one to go first. You talk about radical difference, that's it. But there's not a lot of kindness in the broader culture today. Few people are willing to do as Jesus told us to, turn our other cheek. And by the way, Jesus never told the outside world to do that. He told his followers to do that one, okay? Don't expect people that don't know God to turn the other cheek, okay? Everybody is easily offended. I mean, if I've heard it once, I've heard it a blue billion times. People on TV saying I'm offended by this or that. Frankly, I don't care anymore. I don't care if people get offended. I mean, get over it. Grow up. You know, I grew up in an age where all kinds of things were said to me, and I just had to get over it. I don't need somebody to protect me, my feelings. And we need to be teaching some of this stamina, some of this resilience to our young people. They're growing up in a world being told that their feelings count for everything. They don't. And by the way, you're not, young people, you're not anything special until you do something special, okay? Everybody gets these little attendance awards. Well, nuts. I mean, we need to earn these things if we're going to have these things. And I'm just saying what I believe on that. But everybody these days is offended. Everyone wants to be a victim. And forgiveness these days seems to be a forgotten art, right? I want to tell you a little bit about Botham Jean. Many of you know this story. He was a 26-year-old accountant, member of the Church of Christ, down in the, was it Dallas or Houston area? Dallas area. Graduated from Abilene Christian University with honors. He was a worship youth leader in his congregation. Just everybody loved this kid. This little, I shouldn't say little, he was a big guy, but this guy right here, I would say little to anybody who's under 40 these days, but this man right here was everything. He was the full package on every possible level. He was laying on his couch in his apartment late in the afternoon. A police officer walked in and shot him dead. Okay? And what she claimed, by the way, that she thought it was her apartment, and coincidentally, her apartment, I believe, was the one directly above it or directly below it, okay? I've really struggled with this. I've struggled with it so much. And here's what I've finally come to, and you may disagree with me, you have every right to do so. I don't believe that she intended to do anything wrong. I believe she thought he was in her apartment, but I think she overreacted, even if that had been the case. I mean, she's an armed police officer. Armed police officers are armed. That means you don't have to pull it out and shoot it every time. It would have been totally appropriate if he had been in her apartment for her to pull her gun and have him lay down on his stomach until she got help there. I mean, that would have been the thing to do. So she was wrong there. But I could see me walking into my house and seeing a bad guy in there or somebody in the dark that I didn't really recognize. And I could see me overreacting too. I mean, I could see me doing something like that. Not that it would be right, but I can kind of get my arms around that a little bit. But the bottom line is this young man, with all of his potential and all that life had for him and all the things he'd already done to achieve, was gone. This became a racial issue. I wish that officer had been a black officer, or I wish he'd been white. But it became a racial issue. I don't know that it should have. But in the trial, Botham Jean's brother had this to say: I love this guy.
I hope you go to God with all the guilt, the bad things you may have done in the past. Each and every one of us may have done something that we're not supposed to do. If you truly are sorry, I know I can speak for myself. I forgive you. And I know if you go to God and ask Him, He will forgive you. And I don't think anyone could say it. Again, I'm speaking for myself, not even behalf of my family. But I love you just like anyone else. And I'm not gonna say I hope you rot and die just like my brother did, but I personally want the best for you. And I wasn't gonna ever say this in front of my family or anyone, but I don't even want you to go to jail. I want the best for you. Because I know that's exactly what both of them would want you to do. And the best would be give your life to Christ. I'm not gonna say anything else. I think giving your life to Christ would be the best thing that both of them would want you to do. Again, I love you as a person. And I don't wish anything bad on you. I don't know if this is possible, but can I give her a hug, please? Please?
Yes.
Wow. Every time I see that, boom. I don't know the story. I don't know. I don't know. She asked, did she give her life to Christ? I honestly don't know. We just saw Jesus there. God let us murder his son. Not accidentally in any sense, but out of hatred. And he's loved us back. Now, I don't know that I could have done what he did, but that man right there just, I can't remember ever in my life seeing a better example of Jesus in the flesh. And I'm telling you, leaders, we have to be people who turn the other cheek. We have to be people with that differential advantage, that thing that makes us so radically different and is good from the outside world that people look at us and they say, what in the world is this about? And there will be people that will call him a fool for doing something like that, okay? But the closer to God a person's heart is, the better they can get some understanding of what he did. We have to be that kind of person. And again, I'm not trying to beat anybody up. I'm not trying to over-emotionalize this, but this is emotional. And as God's leaders, we have to be people who rush to forgive. We need to be ferocious forgivers of other folks. And it's hard. Here's what we need to remember, I think. The harder something is to do, the more determined a good leader becomes to do the right thing. The harder it is to do, if you're a good leader, the more determined you are to make it happen. Okay, here we go. Number 14. Good leaders, we have to be aware of the law of unintended consequences, okay? When you lead, be careful about the choices you make. Try to do the best you can to figure out what they're going to look like down the road. And again, I mean, our culture, our government is replete with examples of dumb decisions that sounded good on paper, but in real life they've been worse than any of us ever imagined. A good example of that is, well, let me read this first. Your challenge as a leader is to be careful that what seems right truly is right. Let's take a look at this. How about this minimum wage battle? You know, it sounds great. Oh, give people minimum wage starting at $15 or $25, or who's to say it shouldn't be $150? I mean, you can make a case for it because everybody needs that to live on. And while we're about, let's give them a car and let's do this. Well, the reality is it doesn't work that way. And the reality is minimum wage was never meant to be a living wage. It is a wage designed for young people that are coming into the job market. Anybody that starts on minimum wage should have the desire to better themselves to the point that they can increase that over the years. That's what we need to be doing. However, they pushed this and they pushed it. So what's happened? Well, a good example is at McDonald's. Have you seen any of those? Those kiosks where you come in and pay. You know why they put those in, don't you? It's less expensive to spend the money to put that in than it is to pay some high school kid $15 an hour forever. You can't do that. And you say, well, McDonald's is just greedy. Well, no, they're not. They're not. The point is, we want to say that to McDonald's, but if they say, well, why don't you share it with us? Instead of paying whatever it is, $5 for a Big Mac, let's raise that Big Mac price to $9. How many of us would be on board for that? I mean, that's the real world reality. And the problem is, and then we always have politicians that come along and try to pit people against each other, the rich against the poor, the blacks against the white, anything they can do to keep us in turmoil so we keep going back to them for the solution. That's what's going on in many cases. And leaders, we've got to get past this. We've got to understand that we have to, before we do anything, we have to think down the road. We don't do anything based on our emotions or our feelings at that moment. We think more deeply. And we say, well, long term, what could this mean? Well, in this case, it's meant that a lot of kids that need first-time jobs don't have jobs because of those machines. And that's what I'm saying. As a good leader, we have to be people who can look down the road and not just do what everybody feels like would be a great idea at first until they really put it into place. I mean, what about defunding the police? I have issues with police. Okay, I'll just tell you that up front. I have issues. And I've had times I'm not black, I'm a white guy. But I've had them pull me over and mess me around when I was younger. And I hated it, okay? But I've got to remember that those are rare cops. And most of them are people like we are. They're simply trying to do a job and get back home to their family, okay? And they're scared half the time because they don't know what the other guy's going to do. So they're probably more on edge than they would have been 20 years ago. But at the same point, do we want to defund the police? Well, there are cities that tried to do that a year and a half ago, and one by one, those cities are coming back around asking for more police protection now because the bad guys have taken over. Now, it sounded great. Let's defund the police and send out social workers. Okay, great, if it works, but it doesn't work. The law of unintended consequences is something we need to keep between our ears. We need to understand if we're going to do these things. Knee-jerk decisions are made in haste and repented of in leisure. I like what Jean de La Fontaine, the old French fabulist, said. He said it's very simple. In everything, one must consider the end. Simply put, that's what we need to do as leaders. How is this thing going to shake out? Is it going to work in real life like it works on paper? Let me tell you when not to make a decision. Never make a decision in the middle of an emotional pressure from other people. Never make a decision without doing enough research. Never make a decision out of fear, and never make a decision trying to appease somebody, okay? Because if we're just trying to make people feel good, or we're afraid of what might happen, or whatever, we're not in a middle moment where we need to be making that decision. A lot of us just need to step away from things and ponder, think about things. You know, there's an old saying in the building industry, you know, there's always time to make a mistake and then fix it, but there's never time to measure correctly the first time, you know? And that's what I'm saying about leadership. We need to sometimes just take our time as we make decisions that are going to affect other people. Number 15, don't be a scaredy cat, okay? As a leader, we have to be people who are courageous. And we need to get past the noise of the culture and hear the symphony that God has prepared for us. If we let our heads get lost in the news, if we let our heads get lost in all the tapes and videos at YouTube and everything, we're going to constantly be frightened and scared to death. This is the devil's tool. You know, the Bible tells us about how the devil likes to confuse our brains and how he likes to accuse us of sins and how he's the great liar. You know, perfect love casts out what? What does the Bible say? Perfect love casts out what? Fear. The more close we are to God, the less we're going to be fearful of things. Yeah, we can get ready for bad stuff. We can prepare for it. We should. But we don't have to be afraid of it because we know ultimately God's in charge. Some of the things that have really scared us over the years, how about this one right here? In the 1920s, the Great Depression, stock market, the Dust Bowl. We were being told through that era that the nation would never come back again. I mean, the Dust Bowl was destroying the crops of the Midwest. The Depression was everywhere. The market had completely crashed. Much, much worse than anything we're seeing right now. But it came back in a beautiful way. World War II. The war had started. We were told that Hitler was going to end humanity. Didn't happen. Well, after the war was over, during the atomic age, does anybody know who that guy is right there? Does anybody remember him? Somebody say. Khrushchev. Yeah, that's Nikita Khrushchev. He was the premier of the Soviet Union back in the 50s and into the early 60s. That guy was a crazy guy. That was the day at the UN when he took his shoe off and began banging the table saying, "America, we will bury you." And we believed it. We were scared to death of the Russians. I can tell you that my first trip into Russia was in 1992, right after Glasnost and Perestroika, and it was still very communist. And I can remember walking along in the streets and everything, looking at this mess of a country. They would have been a third world country all those years if it had not been for their military, okay? They were in desperate situation. I can remember looking at this thinking, these are the people we've been afraid of for all these years? Yet when we heard him say that, Americans all over the country started building bomb shelters because we were afraid that he was going to do that. 1960s, we were scared that the population was going to spiral out of control and that America alone would have something in the neighborhood of 200 million people by the turn of the century. Where are we at right now? Is it? I meant to say 2 billion. Sorry. We're going to have 2 billion people, and we're at, what, 330 million, something like that? The population bomb was a huge, huge book that scared people everywhere, promising worldwide famines, all kinds of unrest, wars, criticized for its alarmist tone and inaccurate predictions, but the damage had already been done. People had made all kinds of rash decisions that they shouldn't have made. The 1970s, what about this one? We were told that America was going to freeze to death, that the cooling was coming, and that by the end of the millennia, by the turn of the millennia, 2000, temperatures in America would be so cold we couldn't grow crops. Well, when that didn't work, and by the way, Jimmy Carter jumped on this one too. He told us we were going to run out of oil in the early 70s, or in the, I beg your pardon, the late 70s. He told us we were going to run out of oil, we would not have petroleum. Well, it turns out that we have more petroleum in the ground than we ever realized. America, if we tapped it, America alone would have more petroleum than we would ever be able to use in 100 years. What about in the 1990s? You remember as we were going into 2000? Anybody remember the Y2K scare? All the computers were going to crash. A buddy of mine wrote this book. Now, I wish Mike hadn't written it because it was an alarmist book, but he made well over $1 million on the sales of that one book, scaring people to death. Time magazine was right on board. The end of the world. But, of course, and I was a little nervous. I sat there as the clock ticked over on midnight that night. Nothing happened. But everybody was afraid that it was going to be the end of technology. How about this, the early 2000s? Terrorism hits our country. Now enemies without without airplanes are able to attack us using our airplanes. Maybe they'll bring a nuclear bomb next time. Markets crashed, economy shut down. Airlines, hospitality, retail businesses decimated because they were afraid of this in a way they should not have had to be afraid. And so here's the question. What do all these things have in common? People said that they were different every time. Every time one of these things came along, they promised that it was different this time. All promised worldwide disaster, but none of them happened. And we innovated our way around them. Now, folks, we're smart people in this world. We get around most of these issues that come along. We have to pay attention to them. But things are usually not nearly as bad as we're told. Joshua, God to Joshua, have I not commanded you, be strong and be courageous? Christians, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. That is our promise. And to the degree we're prepared to bank on that, we'll be able to walk through this world as leaders, unafraid of things that people around us are scared to death of. So, who makes money convincing us that the sky is falling? Who do you think that is? Yeah, it's the helmet salesman. Okay? We're going to wrap this one up, and we're going to eat some lunch. And we're going to talk, if you want, a little bit at lunch about this, if you'd like to. And then what we're going to do, we're going to come back in here, and we're going to talk about the concepts of leader. This is something you don't want to miss. I think you're going to enjoy it. We have some health food, i.e. pizza, waiting for us out here. And listen, before I let you go, let me just share with you a little bit. I've got a few copies of some books back here. I know some of you have already gotten these, but if you haven't, I just want to tell you about them again. One of the books back there, Fast Forward Leadership. This is an incredible little book that's really helped a load of people around the world. It's a highly illustrated book, 14 Days to Becoming a Stand-Up Leader. I think you would really enjoy this book. This book right here, Get the Green Light, was actually one that I wrote for salespeople, but we quickly realized that it wasn't just for salespeople. This is for any of us who want to learn how to communicate better, how to persuade, how to talk better with other people. This book, too, is a highly illustrated book, 14 Critical Principles. These are cool. And the last book, Stop Running on Empty. This is the one that Pat and Shirley Boone worked with me on. 8 Proven Skills That Will Change Your Life for the Better Forever. This is a book that I'm really grateful to have gotten out. This book right here is a $26 book. These are both $17 books. Let me see real fast. If I'm doing my math right, that means that these 3 books are $60. What you can do with these books that I've got here, you can't do this with me online, but if you're interested and would like to get these for yourself or for somebody in your family that you think might help, or maybe somebody at work, you can pick out any one you want for $15. And then you can get 2 of them for $20, or if you want all 3, you can get them for all 3 of them for $25. So if you're interested, just grab what there is out there on that table and give me a check or give me some cash or whatever you want to do, and we'll be good to go. So with that said, I'm going to lead us in a word of prayer. And before I do that, I do want to spend, and I almost forgot to do this, I want to just spend a few minutes here on a Q&A. Do we have a little more time?
Yeah.
Good. I want to just open this up for a little bit of question and answer or comments, because I've had several of you say things to me between the breaks, and I just want everybody to feel free to talk. Does anybody have a question on anything that we've talked about or anything you'd like to add? Oh, back here. We got one sister awake. What's your name?
Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
For your books, do you set Venmo?
I'm sorry, I'm not set. We take credit cards and all that sometimes, but I didn't bring anything. If you want one, just get somebody to loan you a little money, pay them back next week. I'm sorry, I just don't have very many here to do that with. Yes, ma'am.
There was a section, I can't remember what section that wasn't really taken over with me, having to do with giving up, not giving up, but getting over certain things, getting over something that's happened, you're telling the individual, get over this, get over that. Sometimes that's not possible for the individual. And you have to look at other ways to help the individual get through that. Because you just can't, this is me talking to you about that sentence. You just can't say to somebody, get over it, I personally feel that that's not the way to do it. And I know you're a professional, you've been making these presentations
Hey,
forever. And,
no, this is good.
I just feel like you need to find out why the person cannot get over it and then address that, because some things are so difficult, people can't get past them. And you have to keep talking and praying with them to help them to understand what it
once we identify through prayer and conversation what it is it feasible to think that we can see that person maybe? Once these individuals have been in prayer about this, and they've explored what it is that's causing this hard situation, is it possible then for that person to get over it?
I think that over time,
Uh-huh.
I think maybe they can understand and eventually get over it, because everybody's in a different place where salvation is concerned.
I don't think you and I disagree.
Growing in Christ, I think everybody's in a different place.
Yes.
But as they get closer to God about this, I think they can overcome. But for them to say that, get over it, I don't know.
Well,
That's-
I don't think we disagree on this. I agree with you fully, everything you've said. You're right, I believe. My get over it comment sounded flip maybe, and I shouldn't have done it that way probably, but what I was trying to communicate is there's so many trivial things that go on in our lives that we let get us bogged down. Sometimes you just shake it and get on with it. That's what I was trying to communicate. Yeah, folks, there are some hard, deep issues that we all struggle with. And just telling somebody get over it's like telling a depressed person get over it. If you're chemically imbalanced and you're depressed, that isn't what you tell a person. You tell that person to get some decent counseling. If it's a spiritual issue, deal with that. But in many cases, it's chemical, and maybe you need some medication. I'm not opposed to medication at all. You don't tell somebody that's depressed, get over it. Because that's just a person who has never been depressed, that doesn't understand how bad it hurts. And it's the same way with issues that some of us struggle with. I think probably most of us have got some deeply rooted things that go back to our childhood, maybe even before, that, it's maybe a lifelong process. But I do believe that in God, we can literally get over anything. I do believe that. And I would stick with, and I don't think you're saying anything different. I think we're together on this. But I appreciate you pointing that out, because that comment I made a moment ago could have come across in a flip way, which I did not intend. So thank you. Thank you. Yes, Barbara.
I think I understood, for me, I think I understood what you meant. Because when we don't let go of things, it gives the devil and
Yes.
power over us. And I think that's why in Christ and forgiveness, imagine if he held a grudge and didn't get over our sins. All of us, hundreds of millions of people, he literally, God and Christ have had to get over us.
Yeah.
Everything we do. So it's actually freedom when you can get over it.
It is, because, anytime you don't get over something, you're carrying a cancer that is only eating you alive. And Barbara, you're so right. And Jesus says on multiple occasions, if we want to be forgiven of our sins, we have to forgive everybody else of theirs. It's not an option. And the only way I can do that sometimes is exactly the way you've suggested. I have to go back and mentally go through the process. Well, what have I done to hurt God? How about these other people? And I have to remind myself of my own evil sometimes in order to get humble enough to forgive somebody else. Well, that's a good comment, both of them. Anybody else? No? Okay. Would you like for us to lead a prayer before we do this?
Yes, I can do that. I just want to let everyone know that I will be setting things on the video so they can start anytime after you're eating. So we'll just kind of get a feel when people are done and ready to start again. We'll be able to start it on time.
That's
Let's
great.
pray. Father, we are thankful for your great love and fellowship that we enjoy with you together.